My sister secretly recorded my private conversations. She forgot I recorded hers too. My sister played a recording of my private conversation at our mother's guardianship hearing and waited for the judge to hear me say that keeping mom at home was becoming impossible. I remember the moment clearly because humiliation sharpens ordinary details. The room, the light, and the expressions around me all became fixed in memory. What looked small to everyone else felt like a verdict on who I was allowed to become. I did not have the language to challenge that verdict yet, so I watched, listened, and stored the truth. Lauren had recorded me secretly, but she had forgotten the meeting in which I recorded her with everyone's written consent. The clip ended before my next sentence, where I explained the renovations and nursing support that could make home care safe. I wrote the information down before speaking to anyone. That habit protected me from the subtle revisions that followed every confrontation. When a date later shifted or a promise became a misunderstanding, I could return to what had actually happened. The record did not make the situation less painful, but it prevented pain from being used to erase precision. I returned to the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Mom's Parkinson's disease progressed slowly until a fall made daily assistance unavoidable. That detail mattered more than it seemed. In my family and in every institution surrounding us, appearances were often accepted before facts. Once a convenient version of me had been repeated, people treated my reaction as the problem and the original cruelty as background noise. I began learning that silence protects the person who controls the story, not the person trying to survive it. She wanted authority over Mom's accounts, despite having no experience managing care. I lived nearby, coordinated appointments, and paid for temporary help while Lauren visited on weekends and criticized every decision. The practical effect reached beyond that day. It changed where I lived, how I worked, and which relationships felt safe. I became more careful without becoming cold. Caution and bitterness are not the same thing. Caution asks for consistency before trust expands. Bitterness assumes consistency is impossible. I wanted a life built on the first, not imprisoned by the second. The clearest protection remained in the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. During a family meeting, Lauren placed her phone face down between us and asked questions designed to produce frustration. I did not respond dramatically. Years of being underestimated had taught me that anger was easiest to dismiss when it arrived before evidence. Instead, I noticed dates, names, and the order in which people changed their explanations. My restraint was not weakness. It was the beginning of a record that would eventually become harder to ignore than any rumor. The next day, Lauren denied recording anything. I noticed the recording indicator reflected in a glass cabinet, but did not confront her while Mom was present. I spoke with people who had no investment in protecting the approved version of events. Their questions were simple and therefore revealing. Who benefited? Who signed? Who had access? What changed afterward? Each answer stripped away another layer of sentiment. The situation became less mysterious as soon as I stopped treating ordinary misconduct as a private misunderstanding no outsider could examine. I kept the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. The choice served a larger purpose: defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Our state required consent from every participant for private audio recording. At the time, I still believed fairness would appear if I explained myself carefully enough. I thought a complete sentence, a clean document, or one honest witness could make people choose decency. The harder lesson was that some people understand perfectly and continue anyway because confusion benefits them. Once I accepted that, my decisions became clearer and much less apologetic. Formal exclusion could not immediately repair social damage. My attorney later explained that the illegal recording might be excluded, But Lauren had already sent edited clips to relatives, mom's neighbors, and a social worker. That was when fear became useful. Instead of letting it circle inside me, I turned it into a checklist. I preserved files, changed passwords, requested certified copies, and wrote down every contact. Action did not eliminate uncertainty, but it gave uncertainty boundaries. Within those boundaries, I could think clearly enough to recognize choices that panic had hidden. Each review of the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The clips made me sound impatient, financially motivated, and eager to move mom into an institution. The pattern was familiar. Someone else created the damage, then assigned me responsibility for preventing consequences. Competence had always been used as a reason to demand more from me. I had confused being dependable with being endlessly available. That day forced me to see the difference, and once I saw it, I could no longer return to the role they had prepared for me. Lauren described the compilation as raw evidence. Pauses were removed, questions appeared beside unrelated answers, and background noise disguised cuts. The consequence was not immediate, which made the waiting difficult. People who rely on pressure often interpret delay as victory. They become careless, repeat false claims, and commit themselves to details they cannot later reconcile. I let time do that work. Every additional explanation created another point that could be compared with the documents already in my possession. I relied on the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail without asking them to carry emotions they could not measure. For the first time, the path toward defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life felt practical rather than imaginary. She petitioned for emergency guardianship and asked to control mom's trust. There was nothing cinematic about my response. I went home, opened a notebook, and began arranging what I knew. Dates created a spine. Receipts and messages added weight. Memory supplied context, but I refused to rely on memory alone. I wanted a version of events that would remain true, even when affection, embarrassment, and family pressure tried to soften it. The alleged buyer was actually a contractor who had quoted accessibility renovations. Her filing said I planned to sell the house below market value and abandon mom in a distant facility. I began noticing who asked how I was and who asked only what I planned to do. The difference separated concern from strategy. Some people wanted reconciliation before accountability because conflict made them uncomfortable. Others quietly offered dates, copies, or memories that helped. I stopped counting neutrality as kindness. In a dispute built on erasure, refusing to look usually protects the person holding the match. The trail through the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail became a structure strong enough to protect my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. I did not need certainty about everything. I needed the next action to support defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Mom had signed a durable power of attorney naming me 5 years earlier, after independent legal advice. People often imagine betrayal as one loud discovery. Mine arrived as a sequence of small contradictions: a changed time, a missing page, a casual sentence that did not match the previous one. Each inconsistency could have been dismissed alone. Together, they formed a design. Recognizing that design was painful, but it also ended the exhausting work of pretending everything might still be accidental. Medical records showed mom had not begun the medication until 8 months later. Lauren argued the document was invalid because medication impaired mom on the signing date. Professional advice gave names to behavior I had experienced only as confusion: misrepresentation, coercion, concealment, retaliation. The words were not magic, but they organized the chaos. Once conduct had a name, it could be answered through a process rather than another circular argument. That shift returned energy I had wasted trying to make unreasonable people admit they were being unreasonable. Whenever explanations shifted, the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail returned the situation to its original shape. The decision made sense because it protected the possibility of defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. I hired attorney Nia Brooks and a forensic audio examiner. I slept badly afterward, replaying every decision that had brought me there. Shame tried to persuade me that I should have predicted the harm sooner. By morning, I understood that trust was not the mistake. The mistake belonged to the person who had treated trust as an unlocked door. That distinction gave me enough steadiness to take the next practical step. Lauren supplied compressed copies and claimed her phone had automatically deleted the originals. He requested original files, device logs, and complete recordings rather than exported clips. I checked the original source whenever possible. Screenshots could be edited, stories polished, and partial documents arranged to create a false impression. Originals carried metadata, handwriting, sequence, and context. The more closely I examined them, the less power the public version held. Truth was not louder, but it was denser. It connected in ways invention could not sustain. I preserved the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail so that exhaustion would never become permission to erase my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. I kept going with one standard in mind: defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The examiner identified more than 40 discontinuities in 12 minutes of audio. The people around me preferred an emotional explanation because emotion could be questioned. Records were less cooperative. A timestamp did not care who was charming. A signature did not become authentic because relatives wanted peace. A financial transfer did not turn into generosity when described at dinner. I began separating what could be proved from what others merely hoped I would accept. The compilation was edited evidence, not a faithful record. Ambient clock sounds jumped backward, room tone changed, and file creation dates followed the day Lauren filed her petition. My instinct was to protect innocent people from the fallout, even when that protection might also shield the person responsible. I had to distinguish compassion from concealment. Compassion helps someone survive a consequence. Concealment prevents the consequence from arriving. I could offer the first without participating in the second, and that became the line I used in every decision afterward. The evidence in the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail did not need drama. Consistency gave it weight. Even on difficult days, the work returned me to defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Lauren told the family experts could make any recording look suspicious if paid enough. For years, I had measured strength by how much discomfort I could absorb without inconveniencing anyone. That definition served everyone except me. Real strength, I discovered, sometimes looked like refusing the emergency, declining the invitation, or letting another adult meet the consequence attached to a choice. It felt unnatural at first because healthy boundaries often feel cruel to people trained by unhealthy expectations. The missing context concerned the cost of maintaining an empty upstairs floor after renovations moved Mom's bedroom downstairs. She released another clip in which I said Mom's house was financially unsustainable. The old version of me would have accepted a private compromise and called it peace. I now understood that secrecy was part of the mechanism. A private settlement without correction would leave the lie available for future use. I did not need public humiliation, but I did need the official record to reflect what happened. Accuracy was not revenge. It was the end of enforced confusion. I learned to trust the connections inside the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail more than anyone's rehearsed certainty. The point was no longer to change another person, but to continue defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. I searched my own files and found a recording from 3 months earlier labeled Family Care Planning. No single piece of information changed everything. The change came from accumulation. One document supported another, one witness explained a gap, one inconsistency made the next question unavoidable. I stopped asking whether the truth was dramatic enough and focused on whether it was complete. Completeness became my protection against a story designed to survive through exhaustion. Each participant received a copy and signed the attendance page. At that meeting, a mediator had obtained written consent from Mom, Lauren, me, and our brother before recording the discussion. Small acts of preparation began changing how I carried myself. I stopped flinching at urgent messages. I read documents twice. I asked for requests in writing. The people pressuring me described this as hostility because informality had always favored them. Structure felt aggressive only to those who depended on blurred boundaries. To me, it felt like air entering a room that had been closed for years. With the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail in order, I no longer had to win every conversation to protect my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. Every boundary became part of defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The full recording captured Lauren proposing that Mom's house be transferred to her for $1 so she could borrow against it. I kept my plans private. The people who had underestimated me were comfortable because they mistook quiet for surrender. They expected either tears they could criticize or anger they could use as proof. I gave them neither. I gave myself time, professional advice, and permission to make decisions without announcing them to anyone who had already shown contempt for my interests. The mediator immediately warned that the plan could be unlawful and refused to draft it. She said Mom would never understand the paperwork and suggested describing the transfer as protection from Medicaid. I grieved while I worked. Those activities can exist together. I could miss the person I believed someone was while protecting myself from the person their choices revealed. I could remember good years without allowing those memories to cancel present evidence. Holding both truths was harder than choosing either denial or hatred, but it left me with a future not organized around resentment. The growing file of the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail allowed the truth to survive moods, loyalties, and delay. That was how an impossible ambition, defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life, became a series of ordinary decisions. Lauren laughed off the suggestion during the meeting and later asked me to delete the file because she had been speaking hypothetically. The hardest part was not gathering information. It was releasing the fantasy that the right evidence would restore the relationship I thought we had. Evidence could establish facts and shape consequences, but it could not manufacture remorse. Accepting that limitation kept me from bargaining away my safety in exchange for an apology someone offered only when every other option had failed. At the time, I did not imagine it would become evidence of intent. I kept it with the signed care notes because it documented decisions affecting Mom. When the pressure increased, I returned to the simplest question. What would I advise a stranger with the same facts? Distance made the answer obvious. I would never tell another woman to surrender records, money, work, or safety merely to prove she loved people who had already used love as leverage. I began offering myself the same basic loyalty I would have offered anyone else. I treated the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail as a map, using each verified detail to decide the next safe step. The outcome remained uncertain, but my direction was not. Defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Metadata showed Lauren downloaded her copy of the consented recording twice, including the night before filing for guardianship. By then, I understood that dignity is rarely recovered through a perfect speech. It returns through repeated choices. I answered only what required an answer. I stopped defending facts that were already documented. I allowed silence to remain in rooms where I had once rushed to make everyone comfortable. The balance of power changed before anyone else was willing to name it. Her confidence depended on believing I would be too embarrassed by the edited clips to examine hers. She knew a complete record of her proposal existed. The turning point came quietly. I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to protect what mattered. Approval from the people benefiting from my silence was never going to arrive. I made the necessary call, signed the necessary form, and accepted that being misunderstood was less dangerous than remaining available for the next violation. What I could establish through the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail mattered more than what pressure asked me to overlook. I allowed the next step to be enough, as long as it advanced defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Nia advised against releasing the recording publicly. What happened next looked sudden to outsiders, but it had been built through years of preparation. Skills gained in ordinary jobs, friendships maintained without advantage, and records kept when no one expected them to matter all converged. The same people who had mistaken patience for passivity discovered that patience can also be a method of becoming impossible to corner. Using evidence carefully distinguished defense from retaliation. We submitted it under protective procedures with the consent forms, transcript, and mediator's affidavit. Later, people called the result inevitable. It was not. The result depended on small choices made while I was tired and afraid. Keeping a receipt, saving a message, asking one more question, refusing to sign. Justice often looks obvious only after someone has completed the invisible labor of making denial impossible. The discipline of maintaining the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail kept my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute from becoming a bargaining chip. The more accurate the record became, the more possible it felt to continue defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The court appointed a temporary neutral care manager while reviewing both sides. I was tempted to make the outcome personal. A part of me wanted the people who had diminished me to feel exactly what I had felt, but imitation would have kept them at the center of my life. I chose a cleaner form of justice, accurate facts, consistent rules, and consequences I did not need to exaggerate. Reality was sufficient once it was finally allowed into the room. The order actually preserved Mom's accounts and prevented either sister from making extraordinary transactions. Lauren told relatives that my authority had been removed because I was dangerous. That experience changed my idea of winning. Winning was not watching another person suffer. It was reaching a morning when their choices no longer determined the temperature of my day. It was having work, relationships, and a home that did not require me to shrink. The formal outcome mattered, but freedom was the part no order or judgment could award on my behalf. By following the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail, I could move forward without depending on a confession. I could not control the response, only whether my actions remained aligned with defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Bank statements revealed Lauren had used Mom's old online credentials to pay $14,000 toward her own credit cards. The next development forced me to separate surprise from disbelief. Surprise passes when new information arrives. Disbelief keeps bargaining with information already present. I had spent too long bargaining. I read the facts in their plainest order and stopped inventing gentler motives simply because the real ones made me uncomfortable. The payment trail matched the urgency of her attempt to control the trust. She labeled the transfers reimbursements for groceries, but produced receipts totaling less than $900. I created a separate chronology for decisions still ahead. It listed what I knew, what remained uncertain, and which uncertainty actually mattered. The exercise prevented unanswered questions from becoming excuses for inaction. I did not need to solve every mystery before protecting myself from the facts already established. I returned to the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The consented recording contained another important statement. I noticed how quickly people reached for my history when they could not answer my evidence. Old mistakes, old loyalties, and old insecurities were introduced as if they changed the current facts. I refused the detour. A person can be imperfect and still be correct about what happened, and I no longer allowed unrelated flaws to become a license for mistreatment. Her later sworn petition claimed she had never touched Mom's money. Lauren admitted she had been taking small reimbursements without itemizing them, and said families should not behave like auditors. The next conversation was shorter because I no longer filled silence with concessions. I stated the necessary point, requested a written response, and ended the exchange. Removing performance from conflict made the remaining issue easier to see. The clearest protection remained in the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Mom completed an independent capacity evaluation and understood the dispute clearly, despite physical limitations. The situation also revealed the cost of delayed boundaries. Every exception I had made to preserve calm had taught someone that persistence could overcome my refusal. I could not repair that lesson with another explanation. I repaired it by making the boundary predictable, written, and unaffected by the volume of the response. Her wishes had been nearly erased by arguments supposedly made for her protection. She confirmed that she wanted to remain at home with professional support and wanted me to continue financial management under oversight. I asked a professional to test my assumptions rather than merely confirm them. Where the evidence was weak, we labeled it weak. Where another explanation remained possible, we preserved that possibility. Careful limits increased credibility and kept me from becoming attached to claims the record could not support. I kept the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. The choice served a larger purpose, defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Lauren approached me through our brother and offered to withdraw the petition if I forgave the transfers and shared future control. There were days when progress looked like nothing more than not making the wrong call. I did not answer while angry, surrender while tired, or sign while rushed. Those absences were decisions. They created the space in which a better option could remain available long enough for me to recognize it. I declined and directed all communication through counsel. The proposal treated Mom's money as leverage between siblings. Several documents arrived out of order, but their metadata restored the sequence. Creation dates, account numbers, and version histories exposed revisions that polished narratives had concealed. Details no one expected a reader to notice became anchors for the entire timeline. Each review of the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The audio examiner recovered partial originals from Lauren's cloud backup after a preservation order. I began treating credibility as something demonstrated through behavior rather than claimed through tone. Calm people could lie. Emotional people could tell the truth. The useful question was whether a statement remained consistent with records and later conduct. That standard protected me from charm without requiring me to distrust everyone. One project folder was titled Pressure Clips. The files confirmed she had recorded multiple private conversations without consent, removed context, and renamed edited exports as originals. I made practical plans for more than one outcome. That reduced the power of threats based on uncertainty. If the best result failed, I still had housing, work, support, and a lawful next step. Contingency planning turned fear from a wall into a set of doors. I relied on the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail without asking them to carry emotions they could not measure. For the first time, the path toward defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life felt practical rather than imaginary. Messages with a local political consultant showed Lauren paid for help selecting the most damaging fragments. As the timeline grew clearer, several memories changed meaning. Comments I had dismissed as jokes now looked like testing. Sudden emergencies looked like rehearsals for later pressure. I resisted the temptation to rewrite every good memory as false. The past was complicated, but complication did not require me to deny the pattern visible in the present. The guardianship case had become a strategy for personal destruction. She hoped scandal would force me to resign from the nonprofit where I worked before the hearing. The emotional requests intensified as the formal options narrowed. I answered compassionately without changing the underlying position. Kindness did not require inconsistency, and a boundary did not become punishment merely because someone disliked meeting it. The trail through the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail became a structure strong enough to protect my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. I did not need certainty about everything. I needed the next action to support defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. My employer conducted an independent review and compared the public clips with complete recovered audio. The people responsible expected my empathy to weaken my position. They knew I could imagine fear, debt, ambition, and shame from another person's perspective. What they misunderstood was that understanding a motive does not erase agency. I could recognize why someone made a choice and still refuse to carry the consequence. I kept my position, although colleagues could not unhear every fragment. The board found no misconduct and issued a statement that edited material had misrepresented my words. One witness remembered a detail everyone else had overlooked. It did not decide the matter alone, but it connected two records previously treated as separate. I documented the recollection promptly and let the appropriate process determine its weight. Whenever explanations shifted, the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail returned the situation to its original shape. The decision made sense because it protected the possibility of defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Lauren filed a complaint accusing me of illegal recording when the consented meeting entered evidence. I allowed myself one evening to feel the full insult of it. I did not convert the feeling into a message or decision. I walked, cried, and let anger complete its honest work of showing me where a boundary had been crossed. The next morning, I could act without asking anger to design the outcome. She had forgotten not only that I possessed the recording, but that she had expressly agreed to it. The signed forms, opening consent statements, and mediator testimony defeated the claim. I reviewed my own conduct with the same seriousness I expected from others. Where I had made assumptions, I corrected them. Where my language had been sharper than necessary, I acknowledged it. Accountability strengthened my position because it was a practice, not a weapon reserved for opponents. I preserved the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail so that exhaustion would never become permission to erase my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. I kept going with one standard in mind: defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. At the guardianship hearing, the judge listened to the entire section concerning home care rather than Lauren's shortened version. Each new fact narrowed the space available for coincidence. The explanation now required too many unrelated accidents, all benefiting the same person and all disadvantaging me. Probability became its own form of clarity. I stopped apologizing for recognizing a pattern that had been carefully created. Context restored meaning without requiring me to deny exhaustion. My sentence about impossibility was followed by the renovation plan, staffing schedule, and concern for Mom's safety. The official process imposed deadlines that emotion had never respected. Claims required support, responses required consistency, and delay carried defined consequences. Structure did not guarantee justice, but it removed many hiding places. The evidence in the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail did not need drama. Consistency gave it weight. Even on difficult days, the work returned me to defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The court then reviewed Lauren's $1 transfer proposal and her contradictory sworn statements. I changed my routines before I changed my public position. Access was reviewed, important papers moved, and private conversations limited. These choices looked excessive only if the threat was imaginary. Once the records confirmed intent, basic preparation became an ordinary expression of self-respect. Oversight protected Mom without rewarding either daughter's pride. The judge denied her petition, confirmed Mom's existing power of attorney, and ordered independent quarterly account reports. I declined invitations to discuss the matter through intermediaries carrying incomplete messages. Triangles had kept our conflicts alive for years. Direct written communication reduced misunderstanding and prevented each person from editing the exchange for a different audience. I learned to trust the connections inside the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail more than anyone's rehearsed certainty. The point was no longer to change another person, but to continue defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The unauthorized transfers were referred for investigation, and Lauren later entered a restitution agreement. A few people surprised me by telling the truth when doing so offered them no advantage. Their honesty did not solve the dispute, but it reminded me that loyalty and integrity were not opposites. The healthiest support came from people who did not ask me to distort facts in order to prove affection. Civil consequences arrived before the family accepted what had happened. She repaid Mom through the sale of a vacation vehicle and accepted restrictions on financial contact. Money became easier to discuss once every amount had a source and date. Vague phrases such as family help, shared sacrifice, or business necessity dissolved when compared with transfers and balances. Precision returned moral weight to choices that euphemisms had tried to make harmless. With the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail in order, I no longer had to win every conversation to protect my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. Every boundary became part of defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. I pursued a separate privacy claim only for the illegal recordings and measurable employment harm. The pressure campaign depended on speed. Urgent calls arrived before documents, emotional appeals before complete explanations, and deadlines before independent advice. I slowed every step down. Time was not avoidance. It was the condition required for informed consent. It did not require an apology because sincerity cannot be enforced. The settlement required deletion of copies, written correction to recipients, legal fees, and a permanent order against further distribution. I protected time for ordinary life while the dispute continued. I worked, cooked, slept, and answered friends about subjects unrelated to the crisis. Refusing to let the conflict occupy every hour was not denial. It was practice for the life I intended to have afterward. The growing file of the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail allowed the truth to survive moods, loyalties, and delay. That was how an impossible ambition, defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life, became a series of ordinary decisions. Some relatives said both sisters had recorded each other and were equally wrong. I learned to recognize false balance. One person had acted, another had discovered it, yet observers described both as equally responsible for the conflict. That framing rewarded the original act and punished the refusal to conceal it. I would discuss my response honestly, but I would not accept half the blame for a choice I did not make. False balance disappeared for people willing to examine the documents. I showed them the consent page and explained the difference between an agreed record of a formal meeting and covert recordings edited to deceive. A proposed compromise solved the visible emergency while preserving the mechanism that created it. I rejected it for that reason. A durable solution had to change access, authority, or accountability, not merely postpone the next demand. I treated the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail as a map, using each verified detail to decide the next safe step. The outcome remained uncertain, but my direction was not, defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Mom remained in her house after ramps, a downstairs suite, and rotating nursing support were installed. The truth did not need me to sound invulnerable. I could admit fear, grief, and uncertainty without weakening the facts. In fact, releasing the performance of perfect strength made my decisions more accurate. I asked for help where I needed it and kept responsibility where it belonged. The structure reduced both risk and the unhealthy belief that devotion required one daughter to control everything. A neutral bookkeeper handled payments while I coordinated care. I noticed that my body recognized danger before my thoughts admitted it. Tight shoulders, shallow sleep, and the urge to check messages constantly all eased when communication moved into formal channels. Safety became measurable in ordinary physical ways. What I could establish through the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail mattered more than what pressure asked me to overlook. I allowed the next step to be enough as long as it advanced defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. Lauren visited Mom only through scheduled arrangements for several months. Soon, the dispute reached people who knew none of us personally. Their distance felt frightening at first, then relieving. They were interested in authority, dates, duties, and documents rather than family roles or social rank. The questions became narrower, and the answers became harder to manipulate. Their relationship belonged to them, and I stopped serving as translator for consequences Lauren still resisted. Mom eventually allowed shorter, unsupervised visits after restitution began. The most useful allies did not promise victory. They explained risk, documented options, and told me when my preferred interpretation exceeded the evidence. Their honesty made them trustworthy in a way unconditional agreement never could. The discipline of maintaining the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail kept my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute from becoming a bargaining chip. The more accurate the record became, the more possible it felt to continue defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The therapist helped Mom record her own care preferences in video and writing while her capacity remained clear. I stopped rehearsing the speech that would finally make everyone understand. Understanding was not a prerequisite for protection. Some people would continue preferring the version that demanded least from them. My task was to make sure their preference could not control the formal outcome. Her voice became the central record instead of evidence each daughter could arrange around herself. She described whom she trusted, what risks she accepted, and how disputes should be resolved. Once the central facts were accepted, the remaining arguments shifted toward intent. I understood why. People often hope a sympathetic motive will cancel an objective act. Motive can shape consequence, but it cannot make an unauthorized signature, transfer, or decision disappear. By following the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail, I could move forward without depending on a confession. I could not control the response, only whether my actions remained aligned with defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. At the nonprofit, I proposed a policy requiring complete source review before staff reacted to anonymous audio or video. The emerging consequences were created by the original choices, not by my decision to document them. I repeated that distinction whenever guilt arrived. A smoke alarm does not start the fire, and the person who calls for help does not create the damage responders uncover. What happened to me became a reason to improve procedure without turning my injury into permanent authority. The board adopted it for everyone, not as a personal favor. I prepared for the formal meeting by arranging the story around verified events rather than emotional importance. The most painful moment was not always the legally relevant one. Respecting that difference allowed the decision-maker to see the pattern without being asked to carry my entire grief. I returned to the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. I stored the evidentiary recordings with counsel and removed every copy from my daily devices. For the first time, I could imagine an ending that was not reconciliation or destruction. There was a third possibility: accurate distance. We could occupy the same history without sharing access, and I could release the argument without surrendering the record. Refusing that impulse was part of returning privacy to my own life. For weeks, I had wanted to record every call in case another lie appeared. When a fair opportunity for resolution finally appeared, I evaluated it against the future rather than the insult. I asked whether it restored resources, corrected the record, and reduced the chance of repetition. Satisfaction mattered less than stability. The clearest protection remained in the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. My sister secretly recorded my private conversations and believed editing gave her ownership of meaning. The result began taking shape through ordinary procedures rather than dramatic revelation. Notices were delivered, accounts reconciled, and statements compared. That quiet machinery mattered because it gave the truth somewhere to go after private appeals had failed. Her clips were designed to manufacture a person. My recording preserved a meeting exactly as everyone agreed it should. She forgot I recorded hers too, but the decisive difference was consent, completeness, and purpose. After the decision, I changed passwords and routines one final time, then stopped checking for new harm every hour. Protection that never allows vigilance to end becomes another kind of captivity. I wanted safeguards strong enough to let attention return to life. I kept the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. The choice served a larger purpose, defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. The following spring, Mom sat in her accessible garden while a nurse helped her plant tomatoes. I understood then why the earlier version of events had lasted so long. It was emotionally convenient, socially familiar, and expensive to challenge. Truth required work from people who had benefited from not looking. I could not perform all of that work for them, but I could refuse to finance the lie with my silence. I did, and the conversation disappeared when the afternoon ended, exactly as private words are supposed to do. She asked me to leave my phone inside so we could talk without screens between us. The first peaceful week felt strangely empty. I had become accustomed to using every spare thought for preparation. Gradually, the empty space filled with work, friendship, and plans that had no connection to the dispute. That was recovery becoming visible. Each review of the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life. I did not leave the experience unchanged. I became slower to confuse familiarity with safety and less willing to treat urgency as authority. That was not cynicism. It was the discipline of making room for facts before surrendering my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. The official record eventually became shorter than the years leading to it. A few pages contained dates, findings, and consequences. What those pages could not show was the private work required to stop organizing my life around my sister Lauren. People sometimes asked whether I felt vindicated. The word suggested a single, satisfying moment. But recovery was quieter. It arrived when I could think about the future without first calculating how my sister Lauren might react. I kept copies of the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail in one secure place and stopped carrying them through every ordinary day. Evidence had completed its job. I was allowed to build a life in which protection existed without constant vigilance. In the end, defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life required more courage than any public confrontation. It meant refusing to become a mirror of the behavior that hurt me. I could insist on consequence without making cruelty my inheritance. The people who had watched from a distance preferred to describe the ending as a reversal of fortune. That description missed the years of work between injury and consequence. Nothing had turned by magic. I had simply stopped donating my silence, labor, and doubt to a version of events that protected my sister Lauren. I also learned that an accurate ending does not require every relationship to be repaired. Some connections became smaller, some disappeared, and a few became more honest after access was no longer automatic. Loss remained loss, but it no longer had authority over my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute. Looking back, the decisive moments were rarely the loudest ones. They were the mornings when I preserved one more file, asked for one more explanation in writing, or declined to solve a crisis I had not created. Those choices accumulated until defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life was no longer an idea, but the shape of my daily life. I did not tell the story to prove that patience always wins. Patience without action can become permission. What protected me was patient action. Checking the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail, seeking advice and choosing a response that would still make sense after the immediate anger passed. There are parts of the experience I still dislike remembering. Healing did not turn betrayal into a useful gift, and success did not make the original harm necessary. I grew because I worked to recover, not because my sister Lauren secretly taught me a lesson I should be grateful to receive. The future became ordinary again in the best possible way. I made plans without building them around another person's emergency. I spent time with people who could hear no without treating it as abandonment. The protection of my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute stopped feeling like a battle and became part of how I lived. If I had one truth to give the person I was at the beginning, it would be this: evidence is not cold, boundaries are not cruelty, and refusing to carry another adult's consequence is not revenge. Those tools made room for defending myself without turning surveillance into a way of life when promises and apologies could not. Eventually, I could hold the whole history without needing to change its ending in my imagination. The facts were established, the consequence belonged where it fell, and my attention was free to move elsewhere. That freedom was the outcome I had wanted long before I knew how to name it. Time did not erase what happened, but it changed the scale. What once filled every thought became one completed part of a much larger life. I could remember my sister Lauren without immediately returning to the moment when my reputation and the truth behind our family's dispute seemed most vulnerable. The final proof was not contained in the original audio, metadata, messages, and payment trail. It appeared in my habits. I no longer apologized for careful questions, confused pressure with love, or waited for an unfair person to approve my boundary. The documents had secured the record. Living differently secured the future.